Apart from all of this kind of stuff, can we identify any cultural and social and psychological dynamics that might help us understand consumerism today? I think there are two that provide a good route into the psychology and the sociology. They are the production of new desires and social mimicry. Some objects, some consumer goods, fulfill a simple, natural, biological need. We eat to satiate ourselves. We buy a bed to sleep on, a home to protect us from the elements. But we're not just a needs species. We go beyond our simple needs. We create new desires, new ways of being in the world. We seem to have a desire for the new, but really understanding what that means, what it could mean, has only developed over the past few hundred years. We can see this shift in what desire means across the 19th century. Sociologist Colin Campbell argues, for example, that Romanticism, that hugely influential pan-European movement that emphasised feelings, sentiments, emotions, novel experiences and adventure and creativity, was an important part of the development of a consumerist outlook. Campbell writes that the consumer withdraws from reality as fast as he encounters it, ever casting his daydreams forward in time, attaching them to objects of desire, and then subsequently unhooking them from these objects as and when they are attained and experienced. As modernity developed and we were unshackled from the circularity of traditional life, of the same routines every day, every month, every year, we began to want to collect something new, experiences. Oscar Wilde satirised this idea of new experiences in his 1891 The Picture of Dorian Gray. Gray exchanges his soul for everlasting youth so that he can live endlessly as a hedonist. Rachel Balby writes that Gray exchanges his moral self for the unbound liberty of the new hedonist. There's no limit to the number of personalities he can adopt, to the experiences he can try. The modern world created adventurers, explorers, dandies and flaneurs, moving through the streets, through the countryside, moving through the world, just to collate and to understand the new. Already in 1655, philosopher and scientist Robert Boyle had written that while other creatures were content with easily attainable necessaries, humans had a multiplicity of desires and greedy appetites. In 1741's Fable of the Bees, Bernard Mandeville had argued against the received wisdom of Christianity, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, that private vice and selfish individual desire were simply pernicious. Instead, he said, they were socially useful, they created more trade, more commerce, and in the end made everyone better off. Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume agreed to an extent, writing that indolent luxury was still pernicious, but that an increase and consumption of all the commodities which serve to the ornament and pleasures of life are advantages to society. When Wilde was writing in the 19th century, Paris was becoming an international hotspot for new department stores, placing a universe of exotic goods on display. In his book The Lady's Paradise, author Emile Zola wrote about the allure of the new stores. He called them altars, a miracle, a machine, and that mad desires were driving all the women crazy. Other Parisians and critics talked about a new type of person, the flaneur, the everyday person strolling aimlessly around the Parisian arcades, just taking it all in, experiencing as much as possible. And at the beginning of the 20th century, as Henry Ford popularised a new method of standardised mass production, capitalists and then advertising executives on Madison Avenue wondered how new desires could be maintained, created from thin air. The father of public relations and Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, wrote that mass production is profitable only if its rhythm can be maintained. Business cannot afford to wait until the public asks for its product. It must maintain constant touch through advertising and propaganda to ensure itself the continuous demand which alone will make its costly plans profitable. Freud himself became central to the new advertising industry. Ad men drew on his theories of sexual desire, oral gratification, and the pleasure principle to sell new brands, new products. The psychologist and marketer Ernest Dichter famously recommended to his colleagues, "Don't sell shoes, sell lovely feet." The shift was that the consumerism and marketing that was developing wasn't about needs, it was about new fantasies, new lives, becoming a new and different person. It wasn't about the present, it was about the future. The bank Lehman Brothers' Paul Mazur wrote that we must shift America from a needs to a desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old had been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs. Some of these new desires, new dreams, new visions were practical. The washing machine freeing up some of the housewife's time, the automobile, the typewriter, but others were criticised as luxuries, sports cars and endless new fashions. Retail analyst Victor Labow wrote in 1955, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate." The landscape of desire was where production, consumption, marketing, advertising, and the individual met. As the philosopher Jean Baudrillard, who we'll come back to shortly, points out in his classic The Consumer Society, heroes of production, colonizers, explorers, founders, industrialists, soon gave way to heroes of consumption, celebrities, gilded princes and sports stars, notable figures that wore the latest designs and drove the flashiest cars.
Paris was once the point of origin for fashion, but nowadays Paris can only send hints to Hollywood. For the rest of the continent looks to the motion picture screen for real information about clothes.
But we don't just consume alone. We don't invent our own desires independently. Those figures, those heroes of consumption, and our social life more broadly, provide models for mimicry. We're an inherently social species. In the old royal courts of Europe, adopting conspicuous styles stood one out from your competitors. Now, celebrities and models and the like set trends, but we all like to be ahead of the pack. In 1899, The sociologist Thorstein Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe the upper-class phenomenon of buying, displaying and wearing luxury goods to distinguish themselves from their peers.
In 1950, the economist Harvey Liebenstein adapted the idea of conspicuous consumption. He noted how not only did the wealthy adopt new styles to set themselves apart, but that the middle classes then copied them to try and display social status themselves. He called it the bandwagon effect.
The Veblen effect, as it's come to be known, means that the acquiring of consumer goods is not just about use, utility, beauty, boredom or innovation, but about status. The value of the good is not just determined by its usefulness, but by the social value of displaying it. But this idea of status is not even simply a surface phenomenon. Being in the know is about having the right knowledge, the right know-how, knowing the direction of the wind and trends. It's all necessary for being accepted in the correct circles, whether that's about class or about being a fashion designer or a tech entrepreneur. Even science has fashionable trends to consume. As the sociologist Roberta Sassatelli writes, there is the knowledge, gastronomical or social, that derives from having eaten out, tasted this or that dish, having used a given type of cutlery, and having managed well the phases of the meal, that is tasting, commenting on the dishes, chatting and exchanging information.
This act of social mimicry functions in a strange way, almost as if it's an engine. Often, once the vulgar, lesser, lower classes begin to adopt a certain style, then it no longer distinguishes the upper classes who bought into it as a fashion and used it to distinguish themselves as unique, as special. And so trends keep revolving as new trendsetters turn away from the crowd and adopt new styles.
The sociologist George Simmel wrote that as soon as the lower classes begin to copy their style, thereby crossing the line of the demarcation the upper classes have drawn and destroying the uniformity of their coherence, the upper classes turn away from this style and adopt a new one, which in turn differentiated them from the masses, and thus the game goes merrily on.
Baudrillard argued that in the post-war consumer society, not only is there conspicuous consumption, but a fantastic conspicuousness. We're everywhere surrounded by styles and images to imitate, new gadgets to employ, and the turnover rate for these new fashions is inexorable.
Okay, so consumerism is maybe about creating new desires and social mimicry. But you might be wondering, what's bad about this? Where's the problem? I buy new camera equipment, new lights, new microphones and books. I have a bike over here that would be impossible to manufacture in the way that it is just 20 years ago. All of these things are desires that have been created. And, well, I watch reviews and things, especially on the internet, and I see what photographers use, etc. So that's the social mimicry. But the point I'm getting at, I guess, is that I find all of this stuff useful. I find the task I use them for, making YouTube videos, meaningful. And I hope you do too. So again, where's the problem? we can categorise the problems critics have identified into two parts. One is quite simple. It's that consumption per se isn't necessarily bad, but its side effects, its unintended consequences, certain types of consumption are. These are things like addiction, environmental degradation, exploitative labour practices, offshoring, and so on.
I'll return to these issues shortly,